Everybody in the neighborhood, almost uniformly, was opposed to integration.
And all of a sudden, these people come out of the woodwork, and they're going to threaten us and call us names.
They were angry because black people were coming to school.
I was assigned to kindergarten, but they didn't want their children in my class.
The concern about skin color is the worst thing we have in our society today.
We needed the law, but the implementation part of it was just horrible.
I'm very, very frightened about what's going to happen to our kids.
Baltimore, pre-1954, was much like many other cities in the nation. Schools for blacks and whites were supposed to be separate but equal. That was the law. And separate they were, but equal was another matter.
I never thought I should get a new book, because what I got was what I'd always gotten, books that had come from, in quotes, the white schools, and they had finished with them, so now they were going to be ours.
Inside the classroom and out, black Baltimoreans were considered second-class citizens. Both Tom DeLisandro and his father are former Baltimore City mayors.
Blacks could not eat in what they call white restaurants, and no such thing as open occupancy or fair employment or anything of that nature.
People were arrested in Druid Hill Park in 1948 for attempting to play tennis together. They were charged with and convicted of conspiracy to incite a riot.
I went to school through a black neighborhood on a bus and came back through a black neighborhood, but that was the extent of my contact with black people.
No matter how much education you obtained, no matter how much money you had, no matter where you lived or how fine your sterling silver was, or if you worked for the B&O Railroad and so forth, you were still just considered a Negro.
Thurgood Marshall, born to a middle-class Baltimore family, was determined to change that perception. In 1935, fresh out of law school and working for the NAACP, Marshall convinced a state court in Maryland to admit African Americans into the University of Maryland's law school. For the next 20 years, he and his mentor, Charles Hamilton Houston, made Maryland a laboratory for testing civil rights litigation.
It was a border state, and it was a state where they thought they had a possibility of winning it.
It would be 15 years before they won another school desegregation case in Maryland, opening the University of Maryland School of Nursing to African Americans in 1950. 2 years later, the NAACP focused for the first time on the high school level, specifically Baltimore Polytechnic Institute's A course, an elite engineering program for the district's best and brightest students.
The A course at Poly was probably one of the most distinguished courses in high school in the country, because graduates from the A course at Poly got sophomore standing at places like MIT and Cornell and Pennsylvania engineering schools.
The NAACP and the Urban League recruited 15 African American teens to challenge the school's barrier to blacks.
These youngsters were eligible in every way for admission to the A course, which was a strict entrance requirement, except for the color of their skin.
We were the cream of the crop. We were the best of the best. We were the best that the segregated, underfunded, overcrowded Negro school system could produce at that time in 1952.
The school board initially proposed setting up a separate but equal A course at Douglas, the all-black high school and Thurgood Marshall's alma mater.
This doesn't mean that the administrative people in the school system were opposed to doing this. They were doing what the law required them to do, and the judgment had to be exercised as to whether this was truly an equivalent course or not.
A September 1952 school board meeting was called to decide the issue. Milton Cornish still has the letter inviting him to attend.
Thurgood Marshall was the final speaker at that school board meeting, and by a vote of 5-3, the school board said they can't actually reproduce the A course, let them go to Poly. So the following week we became Poly boys.
And Poly became the only public school south of the Mason-Dixon line to have racially integrated classes.
It was overwhelming. Overwhelming. You have to remember, this was a segregated society I was coming from. And even though there may have been 15 of us, I don't know whether it was done on purpose or that's the way it happened, it ended up, I think there was one black person in each of the classes. So we were essentially segregated. We were there by ourselves.
The principal at Poly was a good disciplinarian, and he made it clear that he wasn't going to stand for any funny business. If these kids were coming to his school, they were going to be treated properly.
No one was really that bent out of shape about the whole thing, which is probably a little unusual because in society at that time it was a pretty heated feelings, you know, people were divided.
Cornish remembers some subtle hostility in the beginning, but with time, friendships began to develop. Cornish joined the track team and became a record-breaking long jumper. Soon, the black students at Poly were treated like all of the others as they struggled together to survive the rigorous requirements of Poly's A course.
It really is the example that you follow throughout life. If you're qualified and you can do the job, people accept you.
There's no such thing as separate but equal.
Throughout the 30s and 40s, Thurgood Marshall fought segregation with a novel legal strategy. Accept the constitutionality of the doctrine of separate but equal, laid out in the 1896 Supreme Court ruling in the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, but demand that facilities for blacks be upgraded to make them truly equal. By 1952, Marshall was a rising star with the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund.
Well, he was a man for his time.
Dr. Ivory Nelson, president of Marshall's alma mater, Lincoln University, says it was now time for a frontal assault on segregation.
There's no such thing as separate but equal. They were definitely separate, but they definitely were not equal.
The case, now known as Brown versus Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas, was in fact 5 separate legal battles, 3 of which were in Virginia, Delaware, and Washington, D.C. In 2 separate oral arguments, in December of '52 and again 1 year later, Marshall and his fellow lawyers asked the Supreme Court to agree that, by their very nature, separate but equal educational facilities branded black students as inferior, a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled unanimously in favor of the NAACP in a brief, easy-to-understand opinion.
Separation of the races, given the history of the United States, produces functional, structural, inevitable inequality.
The next day, the Baltimore Sun offered its view of the ruling. Media law expert Michael Meyerson has studied the paper's editorials on Brown.
They thought it was an inevitable decision. They did not see it as many of the deep Southern newspapers did, as foretelling the end of society as we know it, or warning of blood in the streets, nor was it wild enthusiasm such as in the African American newspapers or some of the northern newspapers. And the Baltimore Sun was very aware that they were in the middle, but they wanted to be on the progressive side of the middle.
While the May 17th ruling declared segregation of public schools unconstitutional, the High Court waited 13 months after another round of oral arguments by Thurgood Marshall and his colleagues before offering a deadline by which desegregation must occur. In fact, it was no deadline at all. In May 1955, in what became known as Brown 2, the High Court ruled desegregation must take place, quote, with all deliberate speed. Marshall was heartsick, as were many in the African American community. As a writer in the Afro-American put it, "I'm deeply disappointed with the Supreme Court's final decree. I'm hurt way down deep, and I can't hide it. I think the court was wrong in failing to set a time limit on the day that segregation should end."
A lot of the African American newspapers were very, very upset because they were hoping for deadlines, speedy requirements. Some newspapers said that the Supreme Court had sold out to Dixie.
It allowed room for delay tactics, and in some situations, in many situations, delay became the name of the game.
But not in Baltimore. After receiving assurances from the city solicitor that it was on solid legal ground, the school board voted at its very next meeting to desegregate Baltimore City Schools. Remembering the symbolic strength of the Supreme Court ruling, Walter Sondheim says he worked hard as board president designate to gain unanimity at the local level.
So people felt that this was not something that they could have a choice about.
As Sondheim remembers it, the board vote for desegregation was almost anticlimactic.
And it was the first piece of business in the meeting, and asked for a vote. There was no discussion, we had a vote, and the vote was unanimous in favor of it. I don't think it took a minute.
After the vote, Sondheim paid a visit to Baltimore's ailing mayor, Thomas DeLisandro, at Bon Secours Hospital.
I remember his looking at me and saying, kind of looking at me and saying, I don't know whether you did the right thing, which, and this was, a lot of people said that. He said, but the priests here tell me you did the right thing.
Mayor DeLisandro's support was viewed as vital to weathering the public firestorm that was feared. As his son remembers it,
my father was a strong mayor in the true sense of the word. Very few people did anything in municipal government that he did not okay. In fact, I don't remember anybody doing anything that he did not okay. And while the school board was autonomous, they knew that they had the support of the mayor.
So, the stage was set. When Baltimore school children returned to class in the fall of 1954, they would do so side by side with children of another race. No one knew exactly what to expect, but trouble was brewing among some white parents, even at Polytechnic High, where the prestigious A course had been desegregated 2 years earlier.
These people were handpicked and highly selected and were most likely to succeed, and they were smart, you know, and could adjust. But the fear was that, well, once the masses start coming, then that's going to be a different story.
They were taunting, calling us names, making threats.
September 1954, the start of a school year like no other in Baltimore's history. Segregation was ending, but not without a fight. At Southern High, sophomore Francis Neff remembers getting to school early one day and being distracted by the sound of hatred.
And I looked out the window of the school, and the entire perimeter of the school was being circled by cars and people shouting. They were angry because black people were coming to school.
The controversy was not unexpected. Walter Sondheim remembers rumblings throughout the summer as segregationists threatened trouble.
And I know this was tough for a lot of people. It changed the way of life for them, and that's not easy.
Southern was not the only school targeted by demonstrators. Elizabeth Qualls was a new kindergarten teacher at Public School 22. She also remembers angry parents ringing the building.
They carried their children with them to picket around, march around the school with protest signs, and this went on for days.
Even at Poly, where black students had enrolled in the A course 2 years earlier, Brown versus the Board of Education brought new attention and new animosity.
I get off the bus, and here's a whole line of people lining the way with a little opening leading up to the school steps. And they're taunting, calling us names, making threats.
Dowell Schwartz was beginning his senior year at Poly.
Some of the people really were polarized about the issue, and irrationally so, but nevertheless, they felt strongly about it. This should never happen. You know, the school system was going to go down, you know, and separate and not equal was the way.
In an October 1st editorial, the Baltimore Sun criticized attempts by, quote, a few people in several areas of the city to stir up trouble. The protests at Poly ended quickly, thanks to the school's revered principal, Dr. Wilmer D. Huff.
He got on the PA system, said if any Poly boy who's not back in his class in 5 minutes will be permanently suspended. And the few that were out there went running back into the school, and that was it.
Citywide, about a half a dozen schools were targeted by organized protests, but they too were extinguished before long.
A civil liberties leader here in Baltimore discovered something, and none of us knew. There was an obscure city law that said it was against the law to disturb a school when it was in session.
Baltimore police made it clear they would strictly enforce the law. When faced with the threat of arrest, most of the demonstrators simply went home, but racial tensions remained. Outside the athletic fields, there was little interaction between black students and white. Dr. Patricia Welch helped desegregate Eastern High for girls in the fall of 1955.
I saw all of these white girls who were giddy and laughing and chatting, but we were not really a part of those gatherings. Almost all of the African American girls hung together, walked together, stayed together.
And at Poly, says Dowell Schwartz,
there were so few black kids that most of the white kids didn't know them, basically. Unless you happened to be in class with them or something, you just saw them in the cafeteria or walking by.
Black students remember almost daily reminders that they were not entirely welcome in their new schools.
I remember my English teacher asking a question, and she would, if you raised your hand, she would say, "Does anybody else know?"
Less well remembered in the story of desegregation was that black teachers were now assigned to white schools for the first time. Francis Neff says it was no picnic for black faculty at Southern.
It was tough on the black faculty. They were treated like a substitute teacher would be. Everybody was testing them or trying them.
Perhaps the most poignant stories came from the youngest children, kindergartners trapped between their own innocence and their parents' prejudice. Elizabeth Qualls tells the story of Mary, a little white girl, and Sandra, her black friend.
One day they were sitting at the table having milk and cookies, and Mary said to Sandra, "I hate niggers, don't you?" And Sandra knew what it meant, and she was obviously taken aback. But Mary had no idea what she was saying. She was just repeating a familiar phrase that she heard in her social circle.
Qualls saw a pattern emerge over the course of the school year. The younger the children, the more likely they were to accept one another.
They made friends with each other without any apparent awareness of color difference.
But the same could not be said for their parents.
For months, when the white parents and the black parents came to get their children after school, that they never associated with each other in the hall. I think that most people had accepted it. They found out, I think, that nothing terrible happened. But you can bet that for many years, they were still opposed to the idea.
The integration really hurt Black Baltimore.
Baltimore's Polytechnic Institute is a much different place today than it was in 1952 when a small group of African American students helped desegregate the A course. Then, classes were held on North Avenue in what is now the school administration building, and the student body was all white, all male. Now the school is located on Cold Spring Lane. Classes are co-ed, and the student body is 70% African American. But one thing hasn't changed.
The kids are still the best anywhere. Poly is one of the top 5 schools in the state still. Kids go to colleges all across the nation. It's an incredible place.
It is a place of success in an otherwise troubled district. The dropout rate in Baltimore City public schools is 55%, and the overwhelming majority of students fail basic proficiency tests in reading and math.
The problem is, it's not just the Baltimore school system. I think it's every major urban school system throughout the country.
Some feel Brown versus the board is to blame.
With integration, we lost a sense of self. We lost the commitment that we once had to each other.
When things were segregated, we were forced into establishing our own stores, our own movies, our own restaurants, nightclubs.
There were older people in the neighborhood who expected you to bring your report cards to them. And now when I think about it and I smile, Miss Vick probably could not read nor write. In fact, I know she couldn't. But she would take my report card in her hand and say, "Patricia, you did all right."
In those days, the teachers lived within the community. So the students grew up with the teacher not only being a mentor, a friend, but a neighbor.
But it was a cohesive community built on force, not choice. African Americans were chafing against society's racist exclusions.
They wanted equal rights. They wanted the opportunity to attend a law school, or to shop in a certain store, or to move into a certain community.
A number of people thought that when kids started to go to school together, that this would be the beginning of the end of racial prejudice.
Thurgood Marshall himself predicted that school segregation would be entirely stamped out within 5 years of the Brown versus the board ruling. But prejudices die hard. When Patricia Welch graduated from college and went to work as a kindergarten teacher in the early 1960s, she was assigned to what was still a white school in the city's Harbor District.
And when the word went out that there was another new teacher at Thomas Johnson 84, and it was the third colored teacher, what was happening to Thomas Johnson? Another one was coming.
The 1964 Civil Rights Act threatened to withhold federal funds from school districts still segregated. Baltimore City adopted an open-door policy.
We went from 97% white to 97% black, and people pulled their white students out of the school.
That was in the late 60s at Roland Park, one of the city's more elite schools. Jo Owen says her class size more than doubled overnight as the city struggled to more fully integrate the schools.
I had 50 students in a class, in a trailer in the back of the school. The trailer wasn't heated, and when winter came, we started the day out wearing our warm coats, hoping we'd get warmed up before class was over.
Over time, whites who could afford to fled the city for the suburbs, eroding the tax base and draining money from the schools.
Now, the segregation, if you call it segregation, is based on economics.
A good law that had unintended consequences, and the problem with, we needed the law, but the implementation part of it was just horrible.
May we have a motion to approve the minutes for April 13th?
Desegregation has brought many success stories. Dr. Patricia Welch, who helped integrate the schools as a student and as a teacher, is now head of the Baltimore Public School Board and a dean at Morgan State University.
This is the same person who couldn't go to the junior high school of choice. This is the same person with a lot of support and guidance and hard work along the way, hits the gavel to say the meeting is now open, and hits the gavel to say that the meeting is now closed.
Desegregation had to take place, and I have a feeling it would have taken place one way or the other. We saw what could happen during the civil rights movements, with the outbreaks of violence, when Martin Luther King was assassinated.
It is too much to ask one decision to solve all of the social problems, but it did an awful lot to take away the legally enforced segregation of the races. And I think that's a very important contribution.